In the stifling saloon where mail-order brides were auctioned like cattle, tension hung in the air, thick as lamplight smoke. The wooden floors creaked under the weight of desperate men clutching their life savings, their eyes scanning each woman with the calculating gaze of livestock buyers. One by one, the women were announced, receiving looks of desire or cold calculation from the crowd of bachelors, miners, and ranchers who had traveled from distant territories seeking companionship in this harsh frontier land. The establishment itself was a testament to the rough nature of frontier life. Weathered wooden walls bore the scars of countless brawls, bullet holes patched with whatever materials were available. The bar stretched along one wall, its surface stained with decades of spilled whiskey and blood. Behind it, bottles of various spirits caught the flickering light of oil lamps, creating an amber glow that did little to soften the harsh reality of what was taking place. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the room, his words cutting through the haze of tobacco and whiskey that permeated every corner of the establishment. "Gentlemen, we have fine specimens tonight. Strong backs for working the land, gentle hands for tending homes, and beauty to warm your cold winter nights." The crowd erupted in cheers and crude comments, their voices creating a cacophony that echoed off the saloon's weathered walls. Men of all ages and backgrounds filled the space. Grizzled prospectors with gold dust still clinging to their beards stood shoulder to shoulder with young ranch hands spending their first season's wages. Wealthy cattle barons in fine suits surveyed the proceedings with the same detached interest they might show at a livestock auction. Each man had his own story of loneliness, his own reasons for seeking a wife through such unconventional means. The women who had already been successfully auctioned sat in a designated area, their faces showing a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had escaped whatever circumstances had brought them to this frontier town, but their futures remained uncertain. Some clutched small bags containing their few possessions, while others sat empty-handed, having sold everything they owned just to afford the journey west. But when it came time for the young woman with the deep scar running from her left temple to her jawline, silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket. The mark told a story of violence, perhaps an accident, or maybe something far worse. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely, unable to hide the raised flesh that had healed poorly, creating a permanent reminder of whatever tragedy had befallen her. She stood motionless on the makeshift stage, her eyes cast downward, shoulders bearing the weight of every rejection she had ever endured. Eleanor Hartwell had traveled over 2,000 miles to reach this moment, leaving behind the ashes of her former life in Boston. The journey had been arduous, filled with uncomfortable stagecoach rides, nights spent in questionable lodgings, and the constant awareness that she was moving toward an uncertain future. But anything was better than remaining in a city where every street corner held memories of loss, and every mirror reflected her damaged face. The auctioneer cleared his throat nervously, his usual confidence wavering as he looked out at the sea of turned backs and averted gazes. "Now, gentlemen, we have Miss Eleanor Hartwell, aged 22, from Boston. She can read and write, has experience in household management, and comes from a respectable family." His voice trailed off as not a single hand rose, not a single voice called out a bid. The silence stretched on, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second. Before I continue, I'd like to kindly ask you to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Your support means the world to us, and we love connecting with our audience from all corners of the globe. The auctioneer tried again, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "She's educated, gentlemen, can teach your children to read and write, knows her way around a kitchen, and can manage household accounts." Still, the silence persisted. Some men had actually turned their backs to the stage, while others stared at their boots or suddenly found their drinks fascinating. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she maintained her composure, though inside her heart was breaking once again. This wasn't the first time she had stood before a crowd of men, only to be passed over like damaged goods. The scar had become her defining feature, overshadowing everything else about her, her intelligence, her kindness, her strength that had carried her through unimaginable hardships. She remembered the fire that had changed everything. It had started in the kitchen of their Boston home, a simple accident with an overturned lamp that had quickly spread through the wooden structure. She had tried to save her family, rushing back into the burning building again and again until a falling beam had struck her face and knocked her unconscious. When she awoke days later in a hospital bed, her family was gone and her face was forever changed. The other women who had already been sold watched from the sidelines with a mixture of pity and relief. They had found their escape from whatever circumstances had brought them to this frontier town. But Eleanor remained trapped in a cycle of rejection that seemed destined to continue forever. The auctioneer's assistant whispered something in his ear, suggesting they move on to the next woman, but the man on stage hesitated, giving Eleanor one last chance. Minutes passed like hours as the uncomfortable silence continued. Some men began to shift restlessly, eager to move on to the next woman or simply leave the establishment altogether. The atmosphere grew thick with embarrassment and pity, emotions that Eleanor had become all too familiar with over the past 3 years. That's when the sound of unsteady footsteps echoed through the silent saloon. A cowboy, clearly intoxicated, stumbled forward from the back of the room. His clothes were dusty and worn, his hat tilted at an odd angle, and his boots scraped against the wooden floor with each uncertain step. The crowd turned to watch this spectacle, some laughing at his obvious inebriation, others shaking their heads in disgust. Jack Morrison had been drinking since sunset, trying to drown the memories of another failed cattle drive, another season of bad luck that had left him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a single silver dollar in his pocket. The whiskey had made him bold, or perhaps just foolish enough to see past the surface of things that sober men couldn't. At 35, Jack had lived a hard life on the frontier. He had worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana, broken horses for wealthy ranchers, and tried his hand at prospecting with little success. Each venture had ended in disappointment, leaving him older, more weathered, and increasingly convinced that luck was not on his side. The bottle had become his constant companion, offering temporary relief from the harsh realities of frontier life. As he swayed before the stage, Jack's bleary eyes met Eleanor's for just a moment. In that brief connection, he saw something that the other men had missed. A depth of character, a resilience that spoke of survival against impossible odds. Maybe it was the alcohol talking, or maybe it was the recognition of a kindred spirit, someone else who had been beaten down by life but refused to surrender completely. The crowd's reaction to Jack's approach was immediate and harsh. "Sit down, you drunk!" someone shouted from the back. "This ain't no place for your kind," called another. But Jack continued forward, his steps becoming more determined despite his obvious intoxication. With shaking hands, Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out his last coin, a silver dollar that represented everything he had left in the world. The crowd erupted in laughter and jeers as he held it high, his voice slurring as he called out, $1 for the lady!" The amount was insulting, almost comical compared to the hundreds that had been bid for the other women, but it was all he had. $1, Jack repeated, his voice growing stronger despite the alcohol. "I bid $1 for Miss Eleanor Hartwell." The crowd's laughter grew louder, with some men slapping their knees and others making crude jokes about the drunk cowboy and the scarred woman deserving each other. The auctioneer looked confused, unsure whether to take the bid seriously. Some men in the crowd shouted for him to throw the drunk out, while others found the situation amusing enough to let it continue. Eleanor, for her part, looked up for the first time that evening, her eyes meeting those of the man who had just offered his last possession for her. In Jack's eyes, Eleanor saw something she hadn't expected. Not pity, not mockery, but a kind of desperate honesty that matched her own situation. Here was a man who had nothing left to lose, making a gesture that was either incredibly foolish or surprisingly noble, perhaps both. Jack's gesture seemed born of madness, the product of too much whiskey and too little sense. But in that moment, in that rough frontier town where human dignity was often the first casualty of survival, his action carried an unexpected nobility. He wasn't buying her because she was beautiful or because she would be a good investment. He was offering everything he had simply because no one else would. The auctioneer, perhaps moved by the strange poetry of the moment, or maybe just eager to move on from this uncomfortable situation, banged his gavel. "Sold to the gentleman in the back for $1. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some continued laughing, others seemed almost touched by the bizarre turn of events, and a few appeared genuinely angry that such a mockery had been made of the proceedings. As Jack stumbled forward to claim his bride, Eleanor descended from the stage with as much dignity as she could muster. She had expected this night to end in humiliation, but somehow this drunken cowboy's gesture felt different from the rejections she had endured. There was something honest about his desperation, something that matched her own. The paperwork was completed quickly, the marriage certificate signed with shaking hands, his from alcohol, hers from nerves. The local justice of the peace, a tired-looking man who had officiated dozens of these frontier marriages, mumbled through the brief ceremony with practiced efficiency. As they prepared to leave the saloon together, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder what kind of life awaited her with this stranger who had given up his last coin for a woman no one else wanted. Outside, the cool night air seemed to sober Jack slightly. He looked at Eleanor with clearer eyes, perhaps beginning to realize the magnitude of what he had just done. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, two broken souls thrown together by circumstance and desperation. The sounds of the saloon continued behind them, but out here under the vast frontier sky, they were alone with their uncertain future. "I don't have much to offer you," Jack said quietly, his voice no longer slurred but heavy with the weight of reality. "Got a small cabin about 5 miles out of town, but it ain't much. No money, no prospects, just a man trying to make his way in a world that don't seem to want him." His honesty was brutal but refreshing after years of false promises and empty platitudes. Eleanor studied his face in the moonlight, seeing past the stubble and the smell of whiskey to something deeper. "I don't need much," she replied softly. "I've learned to make do with very little." Her hand unconsciously moved to her scar, a gesture that had become automatic over the years. "I'm grateful for your kindness, Mr. Morrison. Whatever your reasons, you've given me a chance when no one else would." As they walked through the dusty streets toward Jack's horse, Eleanor began to tell her story. The scar had come from a fire that had consumed her family's home in Boston. Taking her parents and younger brother with it, she had barely escaped with her life, but the flames had left their mark on both her face and her soul. With no family and no prospects, she had answered an advertisement for mail-order brides, hoping to find a new start in the West. Jack listened without judgment, his own pain making him sensitive to hers. He told her about his struggles as a cowboy, the string of bad luck that had followed him from ranch to ranch, the loneliness that had driven him to drink and gambling. They were both refugees from their past lives, seeking something better in a land that promised opportunity but delivered hardship more often than hope. The ride to Jack's cabin was quiet, both of them lost in thought about what the future might hold. Jack's horse, an aging mare named Belle, carried them steadily through the darkness, while coyotes called in the distance and the wind whispered through the prairie grass. The small wooden structure that appeared in the distance was humble but sturdy, surrounded by a few acres of grazing land that Jack had managed to claim. It wasn't much, but it was home, and for the first time in years, it wouldn't be empty. The cabin itself was a testament to bachelor living, functional but sparse, with little attention paid to comfort or aesthetics. A single room served as kitchen, living area and bedroom, with a small loft for storage. The furniture was rough-hewn and practical, built for durability rather than beauty. But the structure was sound, the roof didn't leak, and there was a good well nearby. Over the following weeks, Eleanor and Jack began to build something resembling a life together. She proved to be everything the auctioneer had claimed and more: intelligent, capable, and surprisingly strong, despite her delicate appearance. Jack, when sober, was kind and hard-working, though he struggled with demons that whiskey temporarily silenced. Eleanor's first task was to make the cabin livable. She scrubbed years of bachelor neglect from every surface, organized the chaos of Jack's possessions, and began to create order from disorder. She mended his clothes with careful stitches, cooked meals that were actually edible, and slowly began to bring a woman's touch to the rough frontier dwelling. Jack, for his part, threw himself into work with renewed purpose. He repaired the cabin's roof, fixed the broken fence around their small pasture, and began planning improvements that would make their home more comfortable. Having someone to work for, someone who depended on him, gave his efforts new meaning. Eleanor transformed the cabin from a bachelor's rough shelter into something approaching a home. She planted a small garden behind the house, using seeds she had brought from Boston. She made curtains from fabric scraps and arranged wildflowers in mason jars to brighten the interior. Most importantly, she created an atmosphere of peace and stability that Jack had never experienced. In return, Jack showed her a gentleness that she had never experienced, treating her not as damaged goods, but as a partner worthy of respect. He never stared at her scar, or made her feel self-conscious about her appearance. Instead, he seemed to see past the surface to the person beneath, something that few people had ever done. The scar that had defined her for so long began to matter less as Jack proved day after day that he saw beyond it. He never asked about the fire directly, but he seemed to understand that some wounds run deeper than the surface. When nightmares woke her in the middle of the night, he would sit quietly beside her until the terror passed, offering comfort without demanding explanations. As autumn turned to winter, their arrangement began to evolve into something deeper. What had started as a transaction born of desperation slowly transformed into genuine affection. Jack's drinking decreased as he found reasons to stay sober, and Eleanor's defensive walls began to crumble as she learned to trust again. The first real test of their partnership came when winter arrived with unusual ferocity. Blizzards swept across the prairie with devastating force, trapping them in their cabin for days at a time. Their supplies ran low, and the cold was so intense that they had to huddle together for warmth. But instead of driving them apart, the hardship brought them closer together. The turning point came during a particularly harsh blizzard that trapped them in the cabin for nearly a week. With nothing but each other for company, they were forced to truly talk, to share not just their histories, but their hopes and fears. It was during those long, snowbound nights that they realized their marriage of convenience had become something real. Jack confessed that he had been drawn to her not out of pity or drunken impulse, but because he had recognized something in her eyes, a strength that matched his own stubborn refusal to give up. "I saw myself in you that night," he admitted. Someone who'd been knocked down, but wasn't staying down. Eleanor admitted that his gesture in the saloon had been the first time anyone had chosen her, flawed as she was, over the possibility of something better. "You didn't see a damaged woman," she said. "You saw a person worth saving, even if it cost you everything you had." During those winter months, they learned to work together as true partners. Eleanor taught Jack to read better, helping him with letters and numbers that would be useful in managing their small homestead. Jack taught Eleanor practical skills: how to handle a rifle, how to read weather signs, how to care for livestock. They were preparing each other for the challenges of frontier life. When spring arrived, bringing with it new possibilities and the chance for a fresh start, Eleanor and Jack had become true partners. The silver dollar that had bought her freedom from a life of rejection now sat on their mantelpiece, a reminder of how the most unlikely circumstances can lead to unexpected happiness. They expanded their small homestead, adding chickens and a milk cow, enlarging Eleanor's garden and building additional rooms onto their cabin. Jack's luck seemed to have changed. He found steady work with a neighboring ranch, and their small farm began to prosper. More importantly, they had found in each other something that neither had expected to find again: love. Their love story became legend in the small frontier town, proof that sometimes the most broken people can heal each other, and that true value isn't always measured in conventional terms. The woman with the scarred face and the cowboy who gave his last coin had found something that all the money in the world couldn't buy: a love built on acceptance, understanding, and the courage to see beauty in imperfection. Neighbors who had initially viewed their union with skepticism began to see the genuine affection between them. Eleanor's intelligence and kindness won over the local women, while Jack's transformation from a drinking, gambling drifter to a responsible husband and neighbor earned him respect in the community. Years later, when visitors would ask about the silver dollar displayed so prominently in their home, Eleanor would smile and tell them it was the best investment her husband had ever made. Jack would laugh and say it was the luckiest dollar ever spent, though they both knew that luck had very little to do with what they had built together. Their cabin, once a lonely outpost on the frontier, became a gathering place for neighbors and travelers. Eleanor's cooking and Jack's storytelling made their home a welcome stop for anyone passing through. They never had children of their own, but they became surrogate parents to several orphan children in the area, providing them with education and stability. In the end, their story proved that sometimes the most valuable things in life come not from having everything, but from being willing to give everything you have for something you believe in. The scar that had once marked Eleanor as unwanted became just another part of the face that Jack loved. And the last coin that had seemed like the end of Jack's luck became the beginning of their shared fortune. Their legacy lived on in the community they had helped build, in the children they had educated and cared for, and in the example they had set of how love can triumph over circumstance. The frontier was a harsh place that broke many people, but Eleanor and Jack had found a way to heal each other and create something beautiful from the broken pieces of their past lives. And in the harsh landscape of the American West, where survival often meant sacrificing dreams for reality, Eleanor and Jack had managed to create something rare and precious, a love story that proved that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most unlikely soil, and that true worth is measured not by what the world sees, but by what two hearts recognize in each other.